I'm delighted now to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker, who will be in conversation today with Mila Atmos, a 2005 SIPA MIA graduate who is the producer and host of Future Hindsight, a weekly podcast featuring in-depth conversations with citizen changemakers. Secretary Deborah Lee James served as the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force from 2013 to 2017 with responsibility for over 660,000 military and civilian personnel and an annual budget of nearly $140 billion. She was only the second woman ever to lead a military service in the United States and made significant advances in readiness in spite of reduction in size of the Air Force. Over her distinguished career in leadership roles across public and private sectors, she also developed deep expertise in public policy, national security, cybersecurity, space, and world affairs, which she documented eloquently in her book, Aim High, Chart Your Course, and Find Success, which we have copies of today. In government, Secretary James served in Congress as a professional staff member for the House Armed Services Committee and in the Department of Defense as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs. In business at SAIC, a government contractor, Secretary James held several positions, including President of the Technical and Engineering Sector, a $2 billion, 8,700 person enterprise. Secretary James, thank you for your service and for joining us today to share your story and lessons in leadership and success. So please welcome our guests.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us here on the stage on SIPA Alumni Day. It's really apt that we're following two leadership awardees. I think what's really special about people who go to SIPA, I think it's incredibly unique, is that the people who come to SIPA and the people who come out of SIPA are people who are confident that they're going to change the world. They didn't come here to, then go out and sit at home. And you are no exception. I think when people look at you, this is the dream trajectory coming out of SIPA to become the Secretary of the Air Force, working in the Pentagon. It's incredibly special. So since we're all alumni here, what did you learn at SIPA that informs your career and ultimately your leadership?
Yes, well, first of all, let me also say thank you, Mila. Thank you, Kirsten, our amazing Dean, Dean Karen. I want to begin by saying, as Secretary of the Air Force, one of the cool things they do almost on day one is they put you through media training. And in media training, we're always taught that no matter what the questioner may ask, you first start with your affirmative case so that you get your point across first, but then hopefully come back to the question. So I just want to say how delighted I am to be here. How delighted I am to be here. Thank you, Kirsten, for not telling my graduation year, but I'm going to go ahead and put it out there, 1981. So it is, it's 42 years since I graduated, and I'm only 45. I was a child prodigy, I also want to say Columbia University is a bit of a family affair for us. So I'm SIPA 81, but my daughter, Regina Lee, who's my guest here today, is Columbia Business School 2013. So you see, I pay it forward. Yeah. I also just want to say congratulations to Radha, to you, and to Jing Dong as well. Amazing, amazing. And to Dean Karen, it's a shame you're producing such underachievers coming out of this school, but we got to do better there. But just amazing, amazing impact and accomplishments to the two of you, and to you as well, Mila. Okay, now to the question. What did SIPA represent to me? It was huge. I will say I did come to SIPA, unlike many. I came directly out of Duke University. I went through in 3 years, and I, of course, did my 2 years here at SIPA. So I was relatively young and had not worked in between other than through internships. But as you've heard from so many, and as you just said, I also wanted to change the world. My specialty in those years was Latin America and public policy analysis. I aspired actually to be in the State Department, had no knowledge or interest even in those days of the Defense Department, but one pivots in life and one finds that there's multiple interests and multiple passions that you can develop. And indeed, I did develop one for defense. Never dreamed that one thing would lead to another, et cetera, and that I would ever have the opportunity to have the enormous impact that a Secretary of the Air Force can do. But what SIPA really did for me was it taught me analytical thinking. It taught me to go beyond simply reading a textbook or listening to a professor and taking notes and memorizing points. It taught me to take those points of view, but to ask the next series of questions and to do the analytical thinking that comes next. It also really helped me to burnish research and writing skills, which were they're still enormously important, let alone for the first job that you would seek. They were truly made the difference for me, I will say. And then I also want to give a shout out to the career development department of the greater Columbia University, because without them, without the connections, without the career recruiters and so on, I couldn't have landed the internships that I landed throughout my time at SIPA and my first job as well. So SIPA was an extremely broadening experience for me, and I will also be forever grateful.
Thank you. Well, I really enjoyed your book. It read like a how-to on leadership, incredibly compelling, and your voice is so authentic. Exactly in the way that you're speaking here on stage is the way you read, the way your book reads, and I recommend everybody here to read it because it's really easy to read and really fantastic and full of great advice. Now, one strong through line in the book is putting people first and working with teams. And I've noticed that you yourself are actually an exemplary team player. And I'm thinking here about your time with the Member Services team on the House Armed Services Committee under Les Aspin. Tell us about that experience and what you learned from that time about how to build teams and how to deploy talent effectively.
Right. Well, as you say, Mila, teamwork it's the name of the game. Whether you're an individual contributor serving on a team, as I was in those earlier days on the House Armed Services Committee, and being able to attract and retain talent and make that talent truly, hopefully, collaborate and work together as a team is about 75% of the game within leadership, in my opinion. So what really makes for a great team? And to me, there's multiple facets, I would say, to that answer. There's not a single answer, but rather there's multiple facets. The first is a team has to have a shared strategic vision and certain shared goals. You have to know where you're going and what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So I would say that's the first facet of a great team. But that's not enough. The second facet then to me is you have to have a diverse group of people, each of whom can bring something to the table to help accomplish that vision and those goals, but who also is curious. Each one needs to be curious and desiring of learning new skills, learning new parts of the job. So it's both the give, what you can give immediately, but what you're also looking to get through that innate curiosity and that ambition, which hopefully is shared. A third piece of it to me is the sense of having each other's back, knowing each other at least enough about one another as individuals, to care for one another and to have each other's back. And then to be able to celebrate wins and to be able to learn from the setbacks that ultimately we all will go through in life. And the final piece is it's really important to have a great leader of that team. And for that leader to have a sense of celebration when things go well and a sense of sharing the limelight, really handing over the limelight when things go well and celebrating the team, but being willing to stand up and accept accountability when things at times don't go well. So to me, those are the key elements of a great team. I had it on the Hill. These were folks I met in the late 1980s, and we religiously still get together at least once a year to celebrate the friendships that have now lasted going on 30 years, almost 30 years.
Amazing, 30 years. Long time. Another through line that I think is incredibly important, especially during this time in our lives, the year 2023, is ethics and integrity. Your whole book is full about really fantastic examples, and you devote a whole chapter to it. So why is it important? And how is it also a team sport?
Yeah, it's both an individual sport and a team sport, and I devoted a whole chapter just because I've had, I would say, a frontline seat at the place of some spectacular ethics failures. So there is quite a lot of data out there which suggests that highly ethical companies that place ethics on a pedestal, so to speak, and they really live by those ethical treatises, they perform better than those that maybe do not have as strong of an ethics culture. The employees of a company, the employees of an organization need to believe there's a fair shot, that things are done properly. When they start to look around and see that it's a culture of cutting corners and whatnot, the company or the organization tends not to do as well. So that's kind of the data. The spectacular failures that I've had the front row seat, I've seen it happen in business, I've seen it happen in government, where leaders set the wrong tone, where leaders will begin to think that they're entitled because, after all, I'm the CEO or I'm the head of the government organization, and I ought to be able to do this and I ought to be able to do that. They do not walk the talk. They say one thing, but then they do something else. Now, I don't know about this crowd, although I suspect this crowd is a lot like me. You can sort of smell a phony about 5 miles away. You can kind of suss out these people. And there's just nothing more morale busting to an organization to see this sort of thing go on. So what I believe and what I have tried to live by is that each of us, at the end of the day, you have your own good name and you have the good name of your organization or your company that you support. So don't ever fritter it away. So we must individually act in an ethical manner. And I call it a team sport because certainly when I was an executive at SAIC, we said all of the time, we want people to report anything that seems off. We want to look into it. It may not be anything off, but just the fact that you're reporting it, this is a good thing for the company, because 1 or 2 bad apples can bring down a very, very solid and good organization and hurt a lot of people. So it's an individual responsibility, but it is a team sport as well.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you next, because I think this is connected to the ethics question, about what you're most proud of having achieved in the Air Force. And when we got ready for this conversation, you mentioned you really wanted to talk about what happened with the nuclear testing story.
Right. So in the book, and if you're able to read the book, you'll see toward the end, I've included 4 or 5 case studies of things that were either my imperative that I wanted to work on, as was the case with sexual assault and as was the case with improving diversity and inclusion in our Air Force. But then there were also a few things that I didn't see coming, a few scandals that simply just hit. And of course, that requires a pivot in leadership. You may have a plan A, but you have to be prepared to pivot to plan B. So the nuclear enterprise scandal is the one that, as I look back on it, I feel pretty proud. And I forget who in history said, don't ever let a good crisis go unaddressed. Don't lose the opportunity to do some good from a crisis. And essentially, that's the story of the nuclear enterprise. It all started with what was a cheating scandal among the young people aged 23, 4, 5, who were standing watch over our land-based nuclear weapons called ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. So when you come across something like this and there's a cheating scandal, you begin to wonder, I did as a brand new Secretary of the Air Force, do they not know how to operate the weapons? Are the weapons in danger of accidental launch, things of this nature? So had to do a very quick investigation. The answer to that was no, the weapons were safe and secure. But nonetheless, this got me, who at the time knew about this much about the nuclear enterprise, this got me deeply, deeply into not only how we trained people It got me into how we supported the weapons of today. It got me into the quality of life of the individuals. It got me into the morale of the force. It became a much, much broader picture for me. And what I discovered was that there were real severe cultural problems, setting aside the lack of integrity of these particular Air Force personnel. There were major cultural issues. There were major funding shortfalls. There were major people shortfalls. So it allowed me over time, through that investigation, to, I think, leave that force in a much better position than the position that I encountered it. The people who cheated, by the way, were removed, and they were dealt with, they were punished appropriately. There were leaders, much more senior people who lost their jobs because, of course, they had allowed a certain culture to be created within these units. So there were many, many facets to it. But the point being, as leaders, I think we all are charged with trying to investigate a problem, figure out what to do, and then either solve it or advance the ball in a positive way. And I do feel proud, and I do feel that myself and the team, because remember, this is a big Air Force, and nobody does anything by themselves, we were able to advance the ball in a positive way.
Well, one thing that really struck me about that story was that the people who were cheating in the test were trying to get hundreds, to get a score of 100 so they could get promoted. And as you said, it's really terrible for morale. And you talk a lot in the book about your 5-step process. So how did your 5-step process work in solving this scandal?
Yeah. So the 5-step process is really a common sense approach, which I would like to think works in sort of any walk of life, or even a problem you might have at home with a family matter, et cetera. Very simply, it's investigate. So before you begin to launch and take action, try to really understand the facts. So obviously that means look at your data, look at whatever your metrics are, but it's also really, really important to listen to people. So one of the things I did to try to get to the bottom of what was happening in the nuclear enterprise, I flew out to the bases with essentially no notice. And just by way of background, when a Secretary of the Air Force visits, it's a big damn deal. I mean, they spend weeks getting ready. So to go out with no notice is kind of like earth-shattering to the people on the ground. In addition, you always go and you speak to the senior leaders when you make a base visit. So that would typically be colonels, maybe a general officer. And yes, I spoke to all of them and I received the briefings and the tours. But in addition, I asked to meet with some of the junior airmen. I asked to meet with different focus groups of enlisted personnel as well as younger officers. And I asked for the leaders to leave. And I took my own notes. I just tried to get them to be as forthcoming as possible. And it was from those focus groups that I learned that in this particular community, which was tested constantly, it was tested 3 or 4 or 5 tests a month on different facets of the job. And the only people who would get promoted were those who got 100% on every test all of the time. So the full activity of the people, it was not taken into account at all. And in every other area of the Air Force, it was much more of a learning culture. This was just a test and prepare to test, and you either get 100 or you are not going to get promoted. So it just seemed to me to be the absolute wrong signal and rife for promoting the wrong behavior. But I got that from a focus group. The colonels didn't tell me that. So that's the importance of listening to people. So that's investigate. Once you have your arms around the problem, you have to communicate. What is your case for action here? And for me, that's communicating to the entire Air Force. It meant communicating to Congress. We called a press conference, and we did this regularly. So communicate is kind of a constant phase, even though I'm calling it step 2. The third phase of this problem-solving approach is activate. Okay, we've figured out what the problem is, we think. We've communicated the case for action. Now, what are we going to do? What are we going to do differently? And so this is where the initiatives come in, or the funding, or the additional people, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a whole bunch that happened there. The next phase is iterate, because no matter what your plan of attack is to begin with, chances are you're not going to get it 100% right to begin with. So some actions won't produce the results that you're looking for. So let them go, jettison. If you're Secretary of the Air Force, you're certainly going to have to negotiate with the Congress because, of course, the Congress can agree with, disagree with, fund, cancel. They can literally do anything to the program that you think is terrific that they wish to do. So negotiation becomes important. Anyhow, that's the iterate phase. And then the most important phase of all is follow-up, because once and done never works. I don't think it works very well in small organizations, and I can tell you with certainty it doesn't work well in large organizations, because it takes a long time to turn culture. But the minute that everybody around you knows that you're going to be devoting your time, that every month you want to report, that you're going to be measuring everything possible, that makes people sort of sit on or stand up and get on their toes about things. And so that's what I did. I tracked this. I went back to those bases over and over, talked to airmen, seeing if some of these changes were being felt. So that follow-up phase is critical.
Yeah, super critical. Now, I hate to turn away from the leadership questions, but this, being SIPA, would not be a complete conversation without some geopolitics. And you were the Secretary of the Air Force. So when it comes to Ukraine, why is the US not supplying them with F-16s?
Well, I would say that President Biden and the top leadership team in power today is trying to thread a very, very difficult needle. They are trying to support Ukraine, which has been attacked by Russia. They are trying to help them push back that attack and eject Russia from as much soil or all Ukrainian soil. But at the same time, they're trying not to trigger a direct confrontation with Russia so that World War III breaks out. We don't want a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia or NATO and Russia. So that's the difficult needle that they are trying to thread. And one can differ with the way they've gone about it, but I wanted to give that sort of as the basic baseline argument. So with that said, you all, I'm sure, have been reading the news. Over the course of the slightly more than a year that this has been going on, the Biden administration has been incrementally moving to give additional types of weapons, more advanced weaponry. So for example, in the beginning, we were not providing the Patriot system, which is an air defense system, a very sophisticated one, but we are now. So we'll see what happens. In the beginning, we were not prepared to provide tanks, the most advanced tanks that we have in the inventory. Announcement not too many weeks ago, we said that we would do so. And indeed, that helped some of the allies provide some other tanks, which actually might be more useful than the M1 that we have committed to provide. So my point is they have evolved over time. Why have they evolved over time? If you recall, in the beginning, Mr. Putin, President Putin, was threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons if certain things happen and whatnot. Well, that didn't quite happen, so that eases up some concerns. I think the world really has been astounded that Ukraine, and hats off to Ukraine and President Zelensky, that he has emerged as being the wartime leader that he has become and that he is, and that the forces of Ukraine and that the population of Ukraine has done as well as they have done over the course of the year. I mean, it's horrible what has happened, and we've all seen the pictures. Parts of Ukraine look like what none of us lived through, but we've seen in historical literature of the aftermath of World War II in Europe. It's going to be an enormous undertaking to rebuild that country when the time comes. But my point is, it has evolved over time that the Ukrainians have done very well. They've been incredibly innovative on the fly. Zelensky has been a stalwart, and he has been a fantastic communicator. So there's that communicate phase, constant communication. Russia has not been 10 feet tall. They've been about 4 feet tall. But 4 feet tall people can still do you some damage, and he certainly has damaged that country. But at least there's been no use of the tactical nuclear weapons, which was extremely worrisome. And so we'll see. So my prediction, my crystal ball is no better than anyone else's, but my prediction is that as this drags on, you may well see that more advanced aircraft does get provided. F-16s, by the way, are no easy deal to fly. So experienced Ukrainian pilots are experienced in the MiG category of aircraft. Flying a MiG and flying an F-16 are not the same thing. So even experienced pilots would have to go through quite a bit of training. So there is that. It would be months long. It wouldn't be years long, but it would be months long. And there are issues of maintenance. There's issues of supply. All of these things would need to be worked out. So it's not as easy as it sounds. But with that said, neither is Patriot. And I would predict if this continues to go on, it will evolve. And the use of F-16 and advanced aircraft, my final point will be, could well be useful, you know, like this spring offensive that seems to be in the making. We believe Russia is going to try to have its version of a spring offensive to break through farther into Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are going to try to break through the Russian lines. Having air power could be very effective for either side. Obviously, we would wish it to be more effective on the Ukrainian side. And of course, some of our allies have stepped up to provide more, say they're going to provide more MiGs for the near term.
Right. It's complicated. It's not a straightforward situation. So as a last question before we take questions from the audience, I wanted to circle back to putting people first, which you talked about at the beginning here and throughout the book. And you are a big proponent of mentorships and sponsorships. If you could give one piece of advice on leadership, what would it be?
Well, maybe if I may presume and give one piece of advice to the assembled graduates of SIPA that we have here today, is that when it comes to leadership, part of being a leader is developing the next generation of leaders. Part of your success as leaders is seeing the people under you go on somewhere else maybe. Maybe they don't continue to work on your team, but they go to lead another team. That really speaks to not only their success, but your success. And as part of that, I say pay it forward. So everybody in this room is in a position now to mentor others and to help develop that next generation of leaders. And I would hope that each of us in our own way could contribute to that. I had a terrific day yesterday. I was hosted by the Saltzman Center and met some of the next generation of leaders that will be coming out of SIPA in the not too distant future, as well as some undergraduates who wanted to join in the conversation. And they were just extremely impressive. And they were really hungry to hear stories. So that's another thing. Each of us has stories that we can share with that next generation of leaders. And we all have stories of the fantastic successes and impacts that we've been able to have, and that's huge, and we should tell those stories. But I dare say each of us has had setbacks. We've had failures, or at least things that felt like failures. I would argue there's no such thing as a failure as long as you bounce forward, go on to the next, keep on keeping on, as they say, and learn from it. Learn from it and take some positive experience, even though it may have been feeling like a failure in life. We need to tell younger people those stories too, because life, as you all know, is ebbs and flows, and you're not going to be on top every day of every week, and you have to build the resilience muscle to be able to bounce forward even in the face of adversity.
Good advice. Good advice. Thank you very much, Secretary.
Thank you.
It's really a pleasure to have you. We are going to take questions from the audience. There are 2 microphones here, right here towards the front by a pillar, and then farther back, sort of under the projector that's coming down. That's another microphone. And there's another one here on the right, a third one, also in the middle. So if you could please step up to the microphone with your questions, and we'll just go in turn. We'll just take turns. First question.
Hi, I actually have, thank you so much for being here today.
Please introduce yourself.
Kavita. Yeah, I'm SIPA class of 2003. Hey, everybody. We came in hot. And I'm currently the director of the Asian Media Initiative at CUNY at the Journalism School. I have 2 questions that are actually related. One is we're experiencing a time of incredible trauma. And as I understand it, there's very few things as traumatic as war. So how do you, and when, during trauma, it's very difficult to think clearly. So how do you make clear decisions? And then how do you create a culture of clarity during trauma as a leader? And the second question, which I think is actually related, is really about ethics and leadership. You spoke so eloquently about ethics, and you are at the head of a very important organization, but that organization is a part of a larger organization where not everyone has a buy-in for ethics and collective thinking. So how do you advocate for ethics and communication when you are also participating with other large bodies that have bad faith actors and do not operate ethically? Thank you.
So beginning with the first part of the question, the trauma of war. First of all, I want to make clear I have always been a civilian, so I have never actually myself experienced war. I've never been a uniformed service member, but I have dealt with many who have returned from war. And it is very traumatic. Believe it or not, my belief from having talked to so many people is when you're in the moment, when you're in the trenches, so to speak, when you're under fire, there's more clarity than you would think possible. I guess it's the adrenaline that kicks in. And whatever the thoughts of patriotism or purpose may be, I think in the moment, the real purpose is my colleagues. I'm going to protect my colleagues. I'm going to try to get through this as best as I can. And this is why we've seen so many instances of heroism in the face of what seems to most of us to be unbelievable immediate trauma. I think the trauma comes, though, afterwards. It comes, and we certainly have a big problem with post-traumatic stress, which is unbelievable to me that it's taken this long in this country. That, you know, we didn't talk about this after World War II. We didn't talk about this very much after World War I, and yet it must have been there. We just didn't recognize it. So the role of someone like me, the Secretary of the Air Force, because remember, I was never a combatant commander. I never directed a battle, but I was responsible for the people, their health care, their quality of life. And so among those responsibilities, I tried to work to ensure that returning servicemen got the best care possible in the military system. Sometimes they would transfer to the VA, the Veterans Affairs system. Neither system is perfect, but a lot of money does go in to support prosthetics. A lot of money has gone into post-traumatic stress, research, as well as care. So this would be more the role that I would put in for. And now, once people come out of the service, the other job that we have is to try to make sure that we do the very best possible to transition them so that they can go forward in their lives and transition into the civilian world with good new jobs and continue to have the support, particularly from the Veterans Administration. So that's the first part. In terms of the second part of your question, the ethics and leadership and what do you do when you're part of a broader group where ethics may not be as important. I will tell you that I think ethics across the military is always important, but there's always people who break it. There are always people, you know, I had 660,000 airmen at the time I was the Secretary of the Air Force. Think about it, 660,000 people, that would be like being the mayor of a small to medium-sized city where on any given day, there was a sexual assault, there could be a murder, there would be some deaths due to training or combat. So all kinds of things are going on with that. So it can be an emotional situation, as you can imagine. I mean, one of the more emotional things that I had to do was travel to Dover Air Force Base, which I did 7 times in my 3 years, where returning servicemen and women who had died overseas would come back, their bodies would come back, and we would go through a ceremony. Their families would be there, and I would do my very best to console the families. And as you can imagine, some were just inconsolable, others were stoic. People react very differently. So how do you deal with this? You deal with this by talking about it. You deal with this by directly communicating it, the importance of ethics at every moment. On sexual assault, I did it constantly. There was never a town hall that I did at any base visit that I didn't talk about how we will not tolerate it, how it will be punished, how we would improve victim care, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to continuously communicate it, and you have to deal with these very difficult issues with empathy. And then you have to walk the talk, meaning when an otherwise really good airman who's fantastic at their job commits an act like this, the job doesn't matter. You get them out and you prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. So in my earlier days, I saw people scoot by. Not during my time, not if I was aware of it.
The next question is the lady, yes, right there, the lady under the projector.
Hi, Mary Olive Smith, class of 95. I'm a documentary director and producer. And you basically just answered my question. It was about sexual assault in the military and whether you felt like you've been able to make a difference. So I'll do a follow-up question, which is, do you think having a woman at the top echelons of leadership is in itself a way to help change attitudes and behavior?
Well, I would like to think so. I think as a general proposition, women tend to be very good listeners. I mean, I love my male colleagues, but you all don't listen as well sometimes. We tend to come at problems from a collaborative way. We tend to come at things with a little bit more empathy. So I think these are some of our strengths. But not all women who are in senior jobs want to be doing issues that maybe traditionally are associated with women. So for example, sexual assault, which by the way, sexual assault in the military affects more men than women, which people sometimes go, whoa, I didn't realize that. But think of the law of numbers. There's so many more men in the military than women. So, but the point is it affects everybody. It can affect anybody, and it does affect men as well. But some women may shy away from, I don't want to talk about diversity, or I don't want to talk about sexual assault because I don't want to just do the women thing. I want to be, a great professional, a great leader. Well, you know what? I want to be a great professional and a great leader too. But these are important issues, so I don't shy away from it. I never have, and I hope I never do.
Next question from here.
Thank you so much, Secretary James, for coming. My name is Brian Greer. I work for Empire Consulting Group, but I'm a class of 2012, SIPA class of 2012. My question is, how do you stay so level-headed in some of these heated situations and issues that you're dealing with as an executive? That's kind of my first question. And Susan, don't hate me for taking two. The second one is, what's your most memorable moment having worked in public service that you cherish and always take with you?
Oh boy, these are hard questions. Wow.
Sorry.
So staying level-headed. Well, first of all, I'd be lying to you if I said I was level-headed. Ask my daughter. I'm not level-headed all the time. Most of the time, but not all the time. I mean, I think the first thing you have to do is when something hits you square in the face that gets you off your plan A and you have to pivot to that plan B, you have to sort of make an assessment. What's the urgency of this matter? How much time do I have for that investigation phase? You may have a few months to investigate something before you have to make a decision. You may have a few hours. You may have a few days. You have to sort of make a rapid assessment of that. And then bring in the team. You're not an island into yourself to get as much information as you can. And then you've got to begin to launch. You've got to begin to, communicate, activate, et cetera, and just tell everybody, hey, I may not have full information yet, but this is my plan. This is how I'm going to proceed. Even if you feel like that innately you're not feeling level-headed, it's important when you're a top leader, I don't want to say fake it, but it's important that you fake it a little bit, because if you're going to pieces, everybody else around you who's looking to you for leadership is going to go to pieces as well. So you've got to kind of either through breathing or meditation or somehow hold it together. It's just really important that you project that calm. So I guess that's the way I attempt to do it. And then I close the door and scream behind those soundproof walls if I need to. The most memorable moment, wow, I think some of the most memorable moment, it has to do with meeting airmen. By the way, airmen is a generic term. It's men and women. It's meeting some of the fantastic people that we have in our Air Force, both today and yesterday. So, you know, I met Tuskegee Airmen, for example. So these are the airmen of yesterday. They're airmen for life. But some of the World War II aces who came from Tuskegee, African Americans who only recently have been getting the recognition that they deserve. I've met the wounded warriors, the very people we talked about who have been through such trauma and got to participate in some of the warrior games, which is like seated volleyball, if you can imagine this, for people who have lost their legs. They actually put me in a practice session with them one time. And you know, you sit there on your butt, and it's a much lower net. And I thought, okay, well, I can do this. I can get the ball over. Well, naturally, these are fierce competitors. So they go for the weak link, which was me. And they spike that ball, bounces off my head. I fall backwards. I mean, I'm glad there were no photographers present at that moment. But, you know, they were very, very inspirational to me. I kept in touch with a woman I met at one of these dignified transfers. I actually ended up mentoring her. She lost her husband to a IED in Afghanistan, and saw her go through the terrible grief. And she went on to serve at the Air Force Academy with other young people, trying to, again, mentor and sort of pass it on, those lessons learned that she had in her life, and inspire others. So she was a great role model for bouncing forward, as I was talking about earlier. So I would say those are the most memorable moments. That and flying in the U-2, which was way, way cool. The U-2 is the high altitude aerial surveillance aircraft. And that's the one that I can't tell you, because it's classified, exactly how high it flies. It's not in space, but it's pretty high up there. And you look up, and you can see through the cockpit, which is clear. You can see the blackness of space. And you look out, and you can see the curvature of the Earth. Wow. And you look down, and there was this little drip of a puddle, which was Lake Tahoe, which is one of the most enormous lakes in the world. So that was pretty cool, too.
Thank you so much.
That's a great question. We'll go right here.
Secretary James, hi. Fernando Arias, class of 2013. Very, very insightful remarks. I really appreciate everything you've shared with us today. So I'd like to maybe ask one additional clarifying question. Leadership and the leadership style and maybe the formula you presented. How have you experienced that dynamic between government and private sector? What's worked in one camp that maybe another camp or another kind of culture would require some recalibration? Any stories that you can share?
Yeah. Well, back to this putting people first, taking care of people, attracting and retaining the right talent in the right jobs, and getting them to collaborate as a team. In the private sector, you do have more levers to pull, particularly when it comes to compensation, than you do in the public sector. The compensation in the public sector is quite established, it's quite set, and there's limits there. But what you can do, and what I think is paramount for the putting people first part of this, and you can do it in the public sector as well as the private sector, is how you value people, how you communicate with people, how you give people the context of decisions, hear them out first, and even if you don't decide to do something in the direction that they are recommending, you give them the why, the context, the celebration of people. When they do fantastic work and they are doing valuable things for you and for the organization. Having a career path. People want to know where they're going in this company or in this organization. So giving that career path advice, giving frequent advice. Young people expect much more frequent feedback than I ever did. I mean, I grew up in a world where you maybe got a performance review once a year and that was about it, and you were expected to just kind of go along and figure it out. I think it's better today that we're giving much more frequent feedback. So these are all of the elements that go into putting people first. And you notice I didn't talk about compensation except in the very beginning. All those other things you can do, and they're separate and apart from compensation. So there are both differences. There's differences in the way that we rate people, obviously, and that we do those performance reviews. But you can do a good job of putting people first in either the public or the private sector if you really work at it.
Thanks. In the back?
Hello, everyone. Drill Gashi, class of 2012.
Yeah. Woo!
Secretary James, thanks for a great presentation. You know, reading your book and looking forward to actually diving into it later. You know, you ran an organization that had 660,000 air persons, right? Airmen. $139 billion budget. You talked about team leadership. You know, what enabled you to be able to lead at that scale and then that complexity? And what did you find that SIPA helped in that regard? What was things you picked up in your professional experience that got you there? And then, you know, talk us through that. I think a lot of the folks in the room have very ambitious goals for saving the world, saving the galaxy. We have to think broader as well. But, you know, doing that includes leading large, complex agencies like that one. So we'd love to hear more about what you picked up along the way that enabled you to do that.
Yeah. So the answer is, you know, you're never fully prepared to do anything in this life until you've done it. So by definition, you know, I wasn't really prepared to lead an organization at that level. But I had certain baseline experiences that gave me, you know, pretty good preparation to lead at a fairly significant level. But again, I'm trying to also admit to you humbly, I was scared as hell to be doing this big job because it really was, you know, 10 cuts above what I had ever done. But it comes back to what's your affirmative case? What are your key strategies, or what's your vision? Where are you going? As for the specific goals underneath, you really need a team to help you build that, but you better go into something like this having a certain vision of where you want to go and what your top priorities are going to be. Now, how did I come up with the priorities that I eventually led with? The answer is I sort of followed the lead of the Secretary of Defense, and my priorities were pretty similar to the priorities that he had set out. They weren't identical, but they were similar to the priorities that he set for the entirety of the Department of Defense. And of course, since I'm more of a people person, I put that absolute first before lethality of weapons and things like that. All of it's important, but you know, what comes first is even more important. So that's one thing. Then it comes to this question of the talent. Now, as Secretary of the Air Force, I didn't have complete say over who were going to be the direct reports. All of these positions on the political side are presidential appointments. I could interview certain people. Other people were already there. You do your best to work with who's there. And on the military side, again, you work with who's there, and as people rotate out, as military personnel do every few years, then you do interviews and so on, and you get a say in who gets selected to go into the job. But that talent, I'll say I kind of got lucky. They were really good people there. They were good people to work with. And in any job, whether you're leading 100 people or 660,000, you're dealing primarily with your direct reports. And those are the people that you're going to depend on. They're either going to pull their weight or they're not, and you've got to give them a chance if they're not and try to be more clear. But those are the people you're ultimately going to depend on above all others to get the job done. Beyond that, here comes the difference between these very large organizations and smaller organizations. The large organizations, there's, you know, what sometimes we call the frozen middle or the iron majors, if we have any veterans in the room, and I know we have a few. It's that middle area that is so difficult to penetrate because senior leaders talk up here, but the people in the middle, they're used to doing things a certain way, and they maybe don't hear it as frequently as the direct reports will hear it. So this is where communication comes into play, and when you have to keep repeating over and over and over again what the top 3 priorities are and what you're expecting and so on and so forth. So I would do a lot of traveling around, and I would be talking, again, town halls, different bases around the country, around the world. And it felt very repetitive in a way, but it's necessary. It's necessary in large organizations to get out there. So, and then I think there's a little bit of pure luck. It's what you do with the crises that come your way. Do you attack them head on and make hopefully better judgments as opposed to poorer judgments? And if you do, that will make you look successful in the eyes of the world. And then finally, a whole part of the book is about getting things done, because isn't that what we're all charged with? Getting things done in life. So you have to create that body of accomplishment in whatever period of time you're able to serve in these highly impactful jobs. At the end of the day, what were you able to get done, and did you advance the ball to leave the organization in a better situation than the situation you found it in?
All right, we have room for 2 more questions. The next one here, and then the last one in the center.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Adam Schur, class of 2013. Thank you. 2013's here. I'm currently the professor of military science at Seton Hall University, and if we can talk a little bit about combining some of the mentorship challenge that you gave to all of us, some of the people first, and really the thing that brings us all to SIPA and keeps us united, as our dean mentioned, is this desire to serve. And one of our 5 pillars, as the dean mentioned, is to uphold and strengthen democracy. In your capacity as secretary, and as you look now, are you concerned about the volunteer force? We, as an institution, are in a competition for talent in the marketplace, and our military is struggling right now with finding recruits, people that want to serve in the joint force, and people that feel a certain civic call to action, to duty to protect our country and our democracy. How should we think about it? Is the all-volunteer force at risk? And what kind of message would you have for people like me and people like us in this room as we try to mentor the next generation to take on public service roles? Thank you.
Yeah, I am a bit concerned about the all-volunteer force, but I'm not so concerned that I think we're on the verge of collapse, is the very short answer to your question. As you all may or may not know, this is a year where we're projecting in virtually every military service to maybe not make the recruiting goals that they have set out to support the force. Some are projected to miss in a larger capacity than others, but all at this point are projected to miss their numbers. And there's a variety of reasons for this. Number one, the attractiveness of military service, I'm sorry to say, tends to rise and fall with how difficult the job market is. So in tough economic times where there aren't a whole lot of opportunities, the military does much, much better when we're talking about trying to get in our forces talented, high school graduates, 18-year-olds, et cetera, et cetera. We do better in those times. We do worse in times where young people have many choices of where they can, get that first job. So we're in such a time now. I'd say that's the absolute number one factor. The number two factor is we can all look back and retrospectively say, wow, some of the war that we've been fighting for the last 25 years, if we could go back in time, maybe we wouldn't make some of those choices, knowing what we know now. And if you read the polls, as I do, most Americans think Iraq was a mistake, right? That maybe we should have never gone in. And that's not the fault of the servicemen and women who served, but it's a fact. We went in because of belief of weapons of mass destruction, and it turned out to be wrong. So this is in the minds of young people. It's in the minds of parents around the country. And that's reducing, I think, the propensity to serve. You add in the fact that on any given day you read in the news about sexual assault and this and that and the other and the death that has occurred. By the way, military service is dangerous even if you're not in war. People die in training accidents. It's like being a policeman, a firefighter. There are certain inherently dangerous jobs, and this is one of them. All of this is working against us. So what do we do about it? I think there are ways that we can bring our own recruiting services much more into the modern world, the way we go trying to attract young people. I think we need a bit of a rebranding in the armed forces writ large. We need to make sure that people understand it's not just about fighting wars. Yes, ultimately, if we can't deter, that's our job. But it's also about learning new skills. It's money for college. It's leadership opportunities. Wow, I mean, there are no young people can not get the leadership opportunities anywhere in the private sector that they can get at, again, an early age in the military. Military, by the way, doesn't just fight wars. The military is front and center on humanitarian operations. There's lots of things that our military does. And I think we need a rebranding to sort of bring it back home, that this is a wider spectrum than what we've seen in the last 25 years. So I'm a bit worried. I know they're working on all these things. But we're not on the verge of collapsing. We're certainly not on the verge of having a serious debate about a draft or anything of that nature. We just have to respond like corporations respond as things ebb and flow, and we need to kick it up a notch.
Thank you very much. Last question.
Hi, my name is Galina Duckworth. I'm SIPA 2003. I see you guys in that corner. Yeah, and I'm also Ukrainian, proud Ukrainian. So my question is going to be about U.S. Thank you. About U.S. response to the war in Ukraine, and it's not going to be an easy question, so I apologize for that. It might be a little bit controversial. So here we are talking to future leaders, current leaders, yet the United States have been criticized for its less than leading response to the war in Ukraine. Like in most instances, the United States was actually following what the rest of the world was doing. Like for example, when you mentioned the example with the tanks, United States committed its Abrams tanks only after Germany committed its Leopards. With the planes, we see that some European countries like Czech Republic and Poland have already committed the planes, yet the United States is yet to commit. So my question is, how do you reconcile that? Call to leadership with the current U.S. less than leading response? How do you teach people to, as you said, walk the talk instead of just waiting until somebody else starts walking first? And how do you teach people to lead and do what's right instead of waiting what bad guys like Putin, whether they're going to follow on their threats or not first? That's my question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would, I guess, pivot back to this premise that I laid before all of you. And again, not being in government, but knowing enough about it, it's a very difficult needle that the top people in power now are trying to thread, not trigger World War III, but at the same time provide aid. And as they can see, I think nobody believed in the beginning that President Zelensky and Ukraine could hold out, and the fact that they have, this has been an extremely encouraging sign. So I believe I'm correct when I say the United States has provided on the order of about $40 billion, either provided or committed in aid at present time to Ukraine, which I believe I'm correct when I say is the most of any country in the world. So could it be more? Yes, it could be more. But 40 billion is quite a lot of money, and it's more than anybody else has committed. And I know in the case of the tanks, at least it's been widely reported, that President Biden was very reluctant about the tanks. He felt that would be an escalatory move. Now, again, you can say, gee, I don't agree or whatnot, but it's this needle that they're trying to thread. But the Leopard tanks, in order to get Germany to do it, it was important that the United States commit as well. And that's kind of what got him over the finish line. But I think we actually said it might have been a day, but I think it was we were the first to say, all right, we'll do the M1s, and then Germany was very quick to follow thereafter. I believe I'm correct about that. So we could certainly do more, and again, my personal prediction, not being in government, but just sort of knowing how things go, presuming that with all of the artillery, the ammunition that the United States has provided that Ukraine can continue to do the fantastic job, unbelievable job of innovating on the fly, targeting as they have been targeting, and at a minimum holding the line, hopefully having a breakthrough in the spring. I predict more is going to be on the way, just like we've seen recently with the Patriots, which I hope will be a great asset for air defense purposes. That's the number one thing still, is air defense, based on my understanding, that is required.
Yes, I think that's right. Well, thank you again, Secretary James.
Thank you.
It was really a pleasure.